had rabbinical students cry in my class when I teach this. So if you read them and you are disturbed about it, you are in good company. If you did not read them, you are going to be disturbed by what I teach today. But we're all grown-ups here, and I have an approach. You could like it, you could not like it. Okay? Mason, are we ready? Are we set? You're gone. Just give me a heads up when it's okay to start the class.
We're all ready, Diane. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Okay, so because the material is so difficult and there's so much to cover, I am going to treat this group as a graduate class. So initially I am going to, I hate to say lecture, but that's basically what I'm going to be doing. I will pause at a couple of places to get your questions and responses. But mostly, please make a note of your questions and issues. Ask them at the end if I haven't already covered them. Is that okay with everybody? I'm looking at nods. I'm looking for nods. I get a nod from Michael and Shirley. Everyone else, Vivian. Oh, I got a thumbs up. Thank you, Charlie. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Can I just see a show of wavy hands for who actually read Judges 19, 20, and 21? Michael, Charlie, Martin, Sheila. Okay. Suzanne, excellent. Barry, are you guys upset about it? How many people are upset about it? Yes, Charlie's upset about it. He's the only one. Barry's upset about it. Oh, Barry, you are not going to be with what?
I'm upset.
You're upset. Okay, good. Okay, I want you to be upset. If you're not upset, you're not paying attention.
I'm upset.
Good. Upset is good. When I first studied this, I was 43 years old. It was my very first graduate course at JTS after years and years and years of not studying formally Jewish studies. And I was outraged that this was in the Bible and I didn't know it. I also thought it was awful. So I spent the entire semester trying to make sense of it in the way I approach most things, which is I did all of the scholarly research I could do. I read what other people had written about it, whatever it was. And then I came up with some synthesis for myself of what kind of sense that made for me. And I'm going to share some of that with you. Obviously, this has been processed and reprocessed because of my commentary on Judges. But basically, when I began this, I was also extremely upset about this being, I couldn't understand why it was in the Bible. And I can tell you that there's a reason that it's in the Bible. So that's the good news. I also want to say something else before we begin. This week, there was some very disturbing news from Israel in which a young girl in a lot was gang raped by 30 men. And we know that this is a true account because some of the men actually recorded the event on their phones. So the way I'm teaching it today is as a theological artifice in the text, but I am in mind of the fact that this happens in real life. Okay, everybody? I had to say that. Okay, but the message for both contemporary Israel and for the biblical story is very similar. And I hope that someone brings it up at the end after I outline what it is. Okay, I hope somebody, Vivian, I'm looking at you. I hope somebody makes a point of that. So I'm going to start by summarizing what's going on in these chapters. Obviously, the summary is coming from my own perspective. So if I'm not explaining, you understand, hopefully that clear. Okay? Starting with Judges 19, an anonymous Levite from the hill country of Ephraim takes a concubine from Bethlehem of Judah. He is an Okay, what did you miss? Oh, now I don't know what you missed.
Yeah, you may have a bad connection. You're breaking up periodically.
Okay, I thought I had the audio fixed on this. I brought it in. I actually brought it into a place. I'm
Right now when you're speaking, but
all right. Let's see how this works. Please, somebody tell me if I'm breaking up. I don't know how to fix it, but I will at least try to repeat. Everyone here is anonymous. You know from earlier studies that when you have anonymous characters, I'm breaking up, Vivian. Is that why you raised your hand? Oh, you're saying hello. Hi. Okay, so when we have anonymous characters, they serve as archetypes. They represent the entire class. So if you have a Levite, you're representing everyone of a similar social status. If we have a concubine, we're representing everybody in that social class, which is a woman essentially without any protection from husband, father, son. She doesn't have the protection of marriage. She is the most vulnerable in society, whereas the Levite has some social standing. You understand that the anonymity contributes to the message. Yes, I'm getting 2 nods. Barry, thank you for nodding. That helps a lot. Okay. The nameless woman eventually strays from him to return to her father's house. 4 months later, the Levite goes after her and is welcomed by her father, who entertains him lavishly. Pressed repeatedly to stay, the Levite finally extricates himself and makes his way homeward, along with his young servant, a donkey, and the concubine, in that order in the text. Overtaken by nightfall, the Levite pushes on to Gibeah in Benjamin, where he hopes to be offered shelter for the night. After waiting vainly for hospitality in the town square, an old man who is also from Ephraim finally takes them in and offers them food, drink, and shelter. You understand that in those days, there were no inns, there were no hotels. You waited in the town square and someone took you home for home hospitality. All of the major figures in this story are anonymous, suggesting that each represents his particular or her particular class of Israelites. In the midst of the meal, a mob of Benjaminites surrounds the house and demands that the Ephraimite throw the visitor out so they can sodomize him. The demand is for the male guest, the Levite. Though the Ephraimite offers them his own daughter, he's protecting the rules of hospitality. He offers them his own daughter. Before he can act, the Levite shoves his concubine out to the mob and secures the door against them. The Benjaminites gang rape and abuse the concubine all night. She makes her way back to their host's home and expires there with her hand on the threshold, where the Levite finds her when he prepares to depart in the morning. The Levite dismembers the concubine's corpse into 12 pieces and sends her body parts throughout the land of Israel in a gesture meant to muster an army of troops. Saul uses this gesture, cutting up a heifer, cutting up an animal, when he, in his very first military foray, tries to assemble the troops of Israel to fight against a threat to Yavesh Gilad by Ammon. And that is in the book of 1 Kings, when he's first made king. He is mustering the army of troops in order to avenge the outrage. What is the outrage? That he was violated, that she was violated, that his property was taken. The implication is when Saul cuts up the animal, he sends it with the message that says, all of your herds are going to be cut up like this if you don't muster, right? It's a gesture of, this will happen to yours. When the Levite cuts up the concubine, is his message, all your women will be cut up like this if you don't help? It's totally unclear, totally ambiguous. The implication is that every Israelite risks dismemberment for himself or his women if he does not assemble to fight. This gruesome account in chapter 19 is followed in chapters 20 and 21 by the equally appalling history of the Benjaminite civil war. You didn't know that Israel had a civil war at the end of the book of Judges. It's all of the tribes of Israel against the tribe of Benjamin. And it's triggered by Israel's outrage at hearing the Levites' account of the concubine's abuse and death. The Israelites respond to the Levites' call and also to Benjamin's refusal to hand over the miscreants, which they demand, but Benjamin does not do it. They follow the Levite into battle against Benjamin, the tribes of Israel against one of their own tribes. What could cause this kind of a internecine battle? This is already shocking. In the following chapters 20 to 21, thousands of men on both sides, Israelites and Benjaminites, are slain in battle. Ultimately, the Israelites triumph. The Benjaminite town of Gibeah is burnt to the ground. All the Benjaminite women and children are massacred. The tribe of Benjamin is decimated, reduced to 400 warriors who take refuge in a cave. What do we know about refuge in a cave? Nobody. This is why we have final exams and papers in classes. When anybody in the Hebrew Bible takes refuge in a cave, whether it's a group or an individual, it's a sign of the breakdown of the social fabric. It's a sign of the social breakdown. It means civilization is not there. When Lot and his daughters take refuge in a cave after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, the daughters think they are the last ones on earth, and they get their father drunk so they can seduce him and have children. Their children are Ammon and Moab. Need I say more? So this happens over and over again. Refuge in a cave is a signal that civilization has broken down. Okay, you're all with me? So this is very serious. When the 400 warriors of Benjamin take refuge in a cave, everybody who understands the Bible knows that something has broken irreparably. When they realize what they have done, the Israelite troops attempt to repair this breach in the 12 tribes of Israel by kidnapping women from the towns of Yavesh and Shiloh as wives for the surviving Benjaminites, slaying the brothers and fathers of these women in the process. That's an effective approach. At the conclusion of these gruesome events, the narrator notes that in those days there was no king in Israel and that everyone does what is right in his own eyes. This is the very final verse, the very final sentence in the book of Judges. This litany, which occurs 3 times in the book of Judges, highlights the ruptured social fabric of Israel that requires a change in leadership in order to heal. It makes the case for the Israelite hereditary monarchy. And of course, the very next chapter in the book of 1 Samuel is the start of, recounts the birth of Samuel, who's the only biblical figure to anoint not 1, but 2 of Israel's kings. Now that I have summarized this really horrific episode, what do you think is the theological, moral, and ethical message of these chapters in Israel? You can unmute yourselves if you want to talk. Mason, you can unmute people if you want to. I want to hear from you before I go on to talk about my interpretation. And I'm not seeing anyone wanting to talk. Even Arthur, you can unmute yourselves, Mason said.
I think that it, just from 3 or 4 minutes ago, from the start of this, it sounded like there was something else brewing and that this set it off like a powder keg, but that there sounded like there was something else brewing that maybe we don't know about, or maybe you know about, because I don't want to say not trivial, but this happening to one person would not be enough to set off such a powder keg unless there were some pre-existing conditions between the 2 tribes that this just blew up. This was the last straw, and that's what happened. That was my take on it. Maybe I'm off base.
You know that the immediate cause was not just that she got raped and murdered. The immediate cause is he cut her up and sent the pieces around to the whole country. That's what got everybody interested in it. There's no social media in those days. There's no newspapers in those days. There's no way of news traveling that quickly. But he did this gesture that's meant to be a parody of what Saul does and a critique of what Saul does when he cuts up the animal and musters a troop. The book of Judges is negative about monarchy in general, but really doesn't like Saul a lot. So there is an immediate cause for this, Arthur, I'm just saying. Okay, so first Barry and then Marty and then Sheila. So first Barry and then Suzanne. Barry, go ahead.
The fact that a Levite is the one who kind of generates, you would think that a Levite would be the most moral and observant class in Israel. So if they're acting in this way, God knows how the rest of the population
Excellent.
is acting.
That's the archetypal idea, yes. Who did I say was next? Sheila, I think I said you. Oh, Marty and Sheila. Marty and then Sheila, okay.
But intermittent during the course of this conflict, this communication allegedly with God, who eggs them on.
Yes, we're going to talk about that in a second too. There's a very disturbing. That's a very disturbing thing that happens. You're absolutely right. Martin and Florence, you have a wonderful background, but it's tearing, and you guys disappear from time to time as you move. So you may want to pick a kind of more even background than the busy one that you have. Your arm just appeared out of nowhere, for example, Marty. Okay, Sheila, go ahead.
Well, what I see is the last line that says, in those days, there was no king in Israel and everyone did as he pleased. Well, that's total chaos. When there's no one to look to as a leader, then total chaos
Sheila,
rules.
Let me ask you a question. Any leader or a particular kind of leader is what's needed, because the Levite is a leader.
A leader with character?
I can see, Barry, this is my concession to the 21st century. I can see that the people in this group are members of the 21st century, and it's very hard to put yourself in the mindset of 1000 BCE, right? It's very hard to do that. But in the universe of discourse of the Hebrew Bible, it's not a matter of only human character. God has to pick the person. The person has to be selected by God. So it's not just, oh, he's a good guy. It's also, here are the signs that God chose him, that he will be loyal to God. There is a hierarchy in ancient Israel in which God is at the top. The prophet who talks directly to God is right underneath God. Then comes the king. How would you like to hear that if you're the king? Then comes the priesthood. So the idea that the king is not just subject to the law of the land, but is also subject to the prophet and to God is a very different kind of monarchy. And that's the kind of monarchy that the end of this chapter is suggesting. But that's an excellent question, an excellent point, Sheila. Suzanne, it's your turn. Unmute yourself, sweetheart.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, the question that keeps coming to my mind is, what was the animosity toward the Benjaminites before this?
Oh, what a brilliant question. It's a brilliant question. I have to say that the tribe of Benjamin is known for its sharpshooting, its warrior, sharp arrow shooting. They didn't have pistols in those days. They're portrayed in this entire story as a bunch of hoodlums. You know, even the larger group won't release the ones who you know, they're taking the side of the ones who committed the atrocity. The really the group that's really criticized, which is the heroes in this story, are the Ephraimites, who are problematic for Gideon and problematic for Yiftach. And here, the old Ephraimite is the one that rescues the Levite and his party from sleeping out in the town square. And he warns them, he says, on no account ever do that. Like he knows it's a bad neighborhood. So this is definitely an anti-Benjaminite critique. Suzanne, who is from Benjamin that might be the object indirectly of this critique? I kind of gave you a hint before when I talked about the parody of cutting up the animals.
Was that Saul?
Yeah, Saul's a Benjaminite. I think there's an implicit critique of Saul here. Okay, thank you. Who else was left? Someone else? Did I get everybody for this round?
I
Barry,
just wanted to add, I just want to follow up on what Suzanne said and what I said earlier. And I'm just thinking that the Benjaminites were so bad that first they said, well, you come out and we're going to rape you to the man. And then he throws a woman out and they say, okay, well, we'll do her. And so it didn't even matter if it was a man or a woman, a male or a female.
Okay, Arthur, I'm disappointed that you didn't read the chapter, because if you had read the chapter, you would know that when the Ephraimite offers his daughter and the Levite's concubine to them instead of the man, they say no thank you. And they actually say absolutely not, right? And it's at that point that the Levite pushes the concubine out to them. And it's at that point, without conceding anything, that they do violence to her. So they reject the woman and then they commit violence because she's there. So in that sense, the text is a little more nuanced, because they're asking to rape the guest, who also happens to be a male, who also happens to be a Levite. It's about every single travesty you could commit in one. They're purposely piling them up. You see that? Barry, go ahead.
Well, just that women seem to be treated mainly as objects, almost sacrificial lambs. You know, they're, despite what you just said, it seems like women are treated as if they're incredibly expendable.
Not in spite of what I just said. It's true what I just said.
Oh,
so listen to this, Barry. You're absolutely right. Over and over in the Bible, beginning with Abraham and Sarah and the wife-sister episode with Pharaoh in Genesis 12,
right.
Women are sacrificed. Women themselves, their lives, their sexuality is sacrificed to the well-being of the men in their tribe, in their clan, in their family. But Lot's daughters are an exaggeration of that. Here, the concubine is sacrificed for the safety of the guest, and the Ephraimite is willing to do that with his own daughter. It's as though, you're absolutely right, within that culture, the woman who is the least powerful, the most vulnerable, is the pawn whose sexuality, whose well-being, whose life is in sacrifice, is easily demanded in sacrifice for the well-being of the men around her. You're absolutely right. So can I continue with this? Yes, you can, if you have questions, please write them down. Do you have a question, Erica? No, you're okay? Okay, so if you have one, Vivian? Okay, unmute yourself.
So first of all, in order to communicate as he did with the body parts, he had to have a messenger carry the body parts. He could have just sent the messenger without the body parts to communicate. Or they used shofars to communicate. So
I think the desecration of her body is a purposeful escalation of the horror. And if you will let me get to that point, we'll have a discussion about that later on. Okay?
Yes.
I'm going to keep going here. Everyone, please mute yourselves. I'm In the final chapters of Judges 19 to 21, the case is made that Israel needs a new form of leadership because, as we said, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. I know it's translated as did as he pleased. It annoys me so much that the JPS doesn't translate the beautiful Hebrew idiom, did what was right in his own eyes. That way, whenever you have an idiom with eyes in it, it's referring back to this linguistically. And I think you should translate as close to that as you can, but I'm not the boss here. Ironically, at the same time that these final chapters make the case for a human king, the stories they recount highlight the dangerous consequences of human folly and human frailty. And I got news for you guys. Being a king chosen by God does not mean you don't have human frailty and you don't commit human folly. This chapter, chapter 21, features the end of the episode begun by the Levite and the concubine in Judges 19. Judges 20 is primarily an account of the battle between Benjamin and Israel. It concludes with the intra-Israelite violence and destruction in this final chapter of the book of Judges. That's when citizens of Israelite towns are destroyed, are slaughtered, are taken captive, are raped. It concludes with a transition to a new leadership paradigm, human monarchy, overturning the theological idea that God is Israel's only king. Up until now, throughout the Chumash, throughout the 5 books, the only king Israel has is God. God can talk to a patriarch, God can choose someone for a task, but there is no king the way the other nations have a king, because Israel is God, because God is Israel's only king. To go from that orthodoxy to the heresy that Israel not only wants a king, but it's okay to have a king, requires a major shift, a major theological shift. The book of Judges is the way that shift is made, the way that case is made. It's not working to have a patriarchy. It's not working to have a single leader who rises up charismatically the way Gideon and Yiftach did. You need to have a system for leadership and succession. And a hereditary monarchy is what our neighbors have, and we want one too. And by saying that the king must be chosen by God, which is what happens in the book of 1 Samuel, when Samuel and God are talking about it, is a way to ease that transition from what has been a heresy up to now to what is now Israel's orthodoxy. You understand there's a major theological shift signaled in these chapters. Are you all with me? Okay, I'm going to get into more detail about the process of how that happens. The chapter concerns Israel's effort to repair the decimation of the tribe of Benjamin by deploying the same exact weapons of excessive force and brutality that the Benjaminites use on the concubine, that the Israelites use when they're battling Benjamin, burning down towns, not even just Gibeah, but all over the Benjaminite territory. They basically wipe out the entire tribe, except for 400 soldiers who are in a cave where society has broken down. They're using the same exact strategy, the same tactics. As Judges 21 opens, for the first time we learn that the men of Israel took an oath when they gathered, when they were mustered at Mitzpah, that none of them would give his daughter in marriage to a Benjaminite. Some of you are wondering when we were going to get to Rash vows. This is the first Rash vow. They're gathering, we are told 3 chapters later, they are gathering and they say, this is an abomination that can't happen in Israel. We're going to look into it and we're going to do something about it. And they apparently make a vow that is not reported then. This is called, this is a device that the Bible uses. For example, when the brothers throw Joseph into the pit, and then later on he's pulled out of the pit and sold into Egypt. What we are not told at the time is that he's screaming for help while they're eating their lunch. We're told later. And that's a delayed exposition. That's what it's called, where you find out later something that makes it even more dramatic. were told later that they made this vow. It's a rash vow. It's a stupid vow. There are going to be dire consequences. Rash vows are frowned upon throughout the Tanakh because they are an inappropriate use of language and are evidence of lack of faith in Israel's God. There can be no good outcome for that vow at mitzvah, and there isn't. The Israelites are horrified that a tribe of Israel is in danger of extinction, but they have taken an oath that none of their own daughters could marry a Benjaminite. Why would you take an oath like that when you're on the eve of battle? This could be a retrojection, projecting back. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't, because basically this is not a newspaper report. This is a literary document. You with me on this? This is not a report of what actually happened. This is a crafted literary document. I'm going to talk about it in a little while, a little bit more. Realizing that the men of Yavesh Gil'ad refused to join the war against Benjamin, the Israelites resolved to decimate the men, women, and children of Yavesh Gil'ad, only leaving the unmarried maidens. They find 400 of these, leaving 200 men of Benjamin without wives, because there were 600 men holed up in the cave. So I want to talk to you about something. Yavesh Gil'ad is in the Transjordan. It's not in the main country of Israel. And the people of Yavesh Gil'ad are associated particularly with Saul, because it is the threat from Ammon, which is a Jordanian enemy of Israel. The Ammonites attack Yavesh, surround it with a military threat, and say, if you don't let us blind your right eye, we are going to come to war with you. That's a coercive threat. And there's nobody to defend Yavesh, which is all, in the margins of Israel on the Transjordan. But Saul has just been made king. And Saul's very first military action is to muster the troops with that cut up heifer and tell them to assemble in defense of Yavesh Gil'ad. And he does it so quickly that when Yavesh says to Ammon, give me 1 day to decide, Saul and his troops are there to help them the next morning. That's how fast this happens. So this is definitely an anti-Saul polemic. It's making fun of the cutting up and the mustering. It's making fun of Yavesh Gil'ad, which was defended by Saul and then later rescued Saul and Jonathan's bodies from mutilation by the Philistines at the very end of chapter 31 of 1 Samuel. And so this is all part of a subtle anti-Saul polemic. The fact that Benjamin is the bad guy, you're beginning to see the pieces pull together. And yet Saul is Israel's first king chosen by God. So at the very time that the text is making the case we need a king chosen by God, there's a subtext that undercuts the good idea of the monarchy. It's subtly saying, but not so fast. It's subverting the idea that a king is a good idea by taking pot shots at the first king of Israel, who is a Benjaminite, who comes to the aid of Yavesh Gil'ad, who cuts up an animal in order to muster troops. Do you see what's going on here? There's a very subtle multi-layer thing going on, and unless you've read the entire Tanakh, you probably will miss it. You could also read a commentary on this subject. Okay. So, you need to find 200 more women for the Benjaminites. The Israelites capture the maidens of Shiloh, who were dancing in the field in a festival of God. What's the problem here? Shiloh was gathered, the people of Shiloh were gathered at Mitzpah. They were among the Theo, among the people. Own son isn't protecting them. This is what happens. Gets out of hand, right? And what happens? How do the Israelites get around it? They still rape and pillage the unmarried women of Yavesh. But they say, since we took an oath and they were on our side taking the oath, Benjamin didn't take the oath. So Benjaminites, you who didn't get wives, during this festival, when the women are hanging around in the middle of the field, you come down and you take the one that you like and you kidnap her. And that way, we didn't violate our oath with someone on our own side. You get wives, and the hell with the women, and who cares about the men and the brothers of Shiloh? This is what happens when one person gets to make all the choices, or when people are making choices regardless of the word of God. You see the theological critique going on here. So that's the second oath and the loophole. Okay. As we talked about before, no thought is given to the feelings or welfare of the women, but also no thought is given to the feelings or the rights of the brothers or fathers. Nobody is safe if the most powerless are not safe. No one is safe. If the threat can be against the concubine and the Ephraimite woman, if the threat can be against the Levite, then the people at risk are the Ephraimite's daughter and the concubine. No one is safe if the most powerless in a society are not safe. I think that goes for us too. Okay. The other thing that I want to point out is that the way Israel treats, the tribes of Israel treat Yavesh Gil'ad is to utterly destroy the men, the children, and the women who have known a man. To utterly destroy them and to only keep the women who are virgins. In Deuteronomy 21, 10 to 14, which was our Parsha a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, I can't remember. This is the way you treat a foreign enemy. This is the way you treat the indigenous peoples you're conquering. This is not the way you treat another city in Israel. That also is part of the parity. No Israelite is going to be treated like an Israelite if Israel does what's right in their own eyes. You're going to be at the same risk as any foreigner, is the message here. The misplaced focus of the Israelites, avoiding the violation of an oath that should never have been made in the first place, completely begs the question of what is actually right in God's eyes. If they're doing what's right in their eyes, and they're so fierce about keeping this vow, you keep the vow because you're honoring the name of God, that the vow theoretically was made in the name of, right? But they're ignoring all of the word of God about how you treat other Israelites, about what you do in a war, they're just ignoring God's word on every level in order to keep this rashly made vow that was ill-advised in the first place. So what's going on here? Okay, let me see. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go to my interpretation, which is based also on the interpretations of two other scholars. One is a sociological interpretation by Susan Neidich. She, I think, is on your syllabus, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe not. Mason, I'm sorry. I should give you the, here. I'm looking for where I put it. Susan Neidich, and the other one is Stuart Lessine, who takes this as an inversion of the Lot story. She looks at, Susan Neidich looks at it sociologically. Both of those informed my interpretation, but mostly what I focused on is the work by David Marcus from Balaam to Jonah, anti-prophetic satire in the Hebrew Tanakh. And basically, his view of satire in the Bible, combined with Susan Neidich's sociological insights and Stuart Lassine's understanding. Stuart Lassine's understanding of the exaggeration and inversion of chapter 19 led me to the following insight. You may not agree with it. You're free to disagree with it, but this is what allowed me to understand it until this week, when we have evidence of 30 Israeli boys gang raping a young Israeli woman. The key takeaway of these chapters for all of us is shock and repulsion. Why do these chapters have the ability to evoke these reactions in all of us? Is the wanton destruction, violence, over-the-top, exaggerated brutality a depiction of the true state of Israelite social structure at the end of the book of Judges? What function is served by ending the book of Judges with a story like this? The final 3 chapters of the book of Judges appear to be crafted in the specific genre of satire. Who here is an English major? On hands. Oh, no one's an English major? I guess I have the field to myself. So I'm going to talk about the genre of satire. It's a particular genre. Some of you will be more familiar with it later on when I give you a more contemporary example than a biblical example. But the genre basically takes a story, starts with it in a very ordinary way that everyone can relate to. It sounds like an account of everyday life, and builds gradually from the mundane to the outrageous, bringing the audience along a little at a time, not even noticing that the water's getting hotter and hotter and hotter, until the horrifying denouement, when the audience cannot deny horror and repulsion. This is the trajectory of the genre of satire. Because the Tanakh is revered as a sacred text, people have been reluctant to identify satire, humor, irony, parody in its stories. Nevertheless, they're there. The Tanakh contains a variety of literary genres, and satire is just one of these. The genre of satire has a long history. You are going to be so surprised by this. Going back even before the Bible, an early example is the Egyptian satire of the trades from the 2nd millennium BCE, 2000 BCE, well, 1500, 1800, 1900 BCE, 2nd millennium BCE, we have Egyptian satire. In order to persuade students who were tired of studying that their lot as scribes is useful, the text argued their role as scribes is far superior to the ordinary man in the street, and it uses satire to make that point. By the 5th century BCE, around the biblical period, the late biblical period around the time of the Maccabees, Nehemiah, Ezra, Nehemiah, the archetypes of Greek satirical drama appear in the comedies of Aristophanes, which are still performed today. Not today, but contemporarily. In modern literature, one of the best known satires is Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal. Raise your hands if you've ever heard of it. I don't care if you know what it says. Ever heard of it? Ever heard of Jonathan Swift? I'll take anything. Yay. Okay. Swift's objective, the date of it is 1729, so it's 18th century. Swift's objective is to arouse compassion for the desperately poor, and to arouse horror and repulsion for the casual neglect of poverty by the privileged classes. This is aimed especially at the Irish, who are experiencing a terrible potato famine, but it really applies to all the poor. Swift ironically suggests that the tender young children of impoverished Irish families be prepared as food for the privileged classes. Swift's proposal presumes a world where a source of income is more important to the poor than the care of their children, where access to delicacies overcomes the scruples of the wealthy. He uses exaggeration and irony to hold a mirror up to his audience, to arouse recognition and revulsion, and ideally to change their behavior. That is the ultimate outcome of satire, to change behavior, to get people to change their political position and make a difference socially. Swift's proposal suffered from a response that often meets the best executed satire. His shocked readers believed he was genuinely proposing cannibalism. Sorry, guys. The final 3 chapters of the Book of Judges together constitute a satire that seeks to evoke the responses of shock and revulsion in the audience, and we all felt it, right? I'm looking for nods. Somebody. Thank you. 3 of you are listening. Arthur was not revulsed and shocked. Okay, Arthur, we'll talk about this later. Maybe we won't. I'm going to stay far away from you. Okay. The ultimate goal is that the behavior depicted in these chapters is rejected by its audience. The idea is that the contemporary audience of biblical period is going to say, oh, no, 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 we're not doing that. That's not happening here. David Marcus notes in his book on biblical satire, Satire in the Prophets, as satire, these stories cannot be regarded as factual accounts. They do not reflect norms of behavior in ancient Israel any more than Swift describes accurately 18th century England. So I am going to take hope from that statement, because when I read a news report that 30 men have gang raped an Israelite woman in a lot, which happened this week, it is not a social norm. It is not a societal norm. It causes outrage and hopefully will make changes. Do you see what I'm saying? The idea is that this is depicted in the 3 chapters as a social norm, as okay, and it is not okay. And we're supposed to feel that it is not okay. The anonymity of the Levite, of the concubine, of her father, of the Ephraimite, of the Benjaminite mob, allow each of those to be read as an archetype or model of a specific social type. Exaggeration, hyperbole, bring the flaws of ad hoc Israelite leadership into focus by taking them to the logical extreme. If you have a leadership that only rises to defend its own self-interest, then you wind up with an extreme like you have at the end of the book. Satire is aimed at creating the recognition of social ills, provoking the motivation to make social change. What social change is demanded by the gang rape of a concubine and civil war in Israel? I know, I'm not going to open it to questions and comments. You're not going to tell me what change is. I'm going to tell you. The theological message is, as we said before, there is no safe refuge for anyone in a time when everyone does what is right in his own eyes. The concubine is not safe in her father's house. He sends her back to the Levite. Or in the home of the Ephraimite. Everybody's not safe in the home of the Ephraimite, even his daughter. And in the hands of the Levite, he shoves her into the mob. Although the concubine is the only one to suffer bodily harm, both the Levite and the old Ephraimite are in jeopardy of their life and limb from the mob, as is the old Ephraimite's virgin daughter. These 3 chapters depict a time in which women and children are in unspeakable peril of wanton destruction from within their own culture. I'm going to say that again. These 3 chapters depict a time in which women and children are in unspeakable peril of wanton destruction from within their own culture. Surely, in such a time, if the weakest members of society are not safe, then no one is safe. Apparently, the rules of hospitality apply only to the men. Women are pawns, their sexuality is hostage to the safety of the men. The old man's virgin daughter is offered to the mob. The Levite actually shoves his concubine outside to be ravaged by the mob. Chapter 1 and mass destruction in chapter 19. There is no refuge for anyone in Israel, whether they are upper social classes, lower social classes, dominant or subordinate. The destruction is staggering. Beyond the untold dead of Benjaminite women and children massacred by the Israelite armies after the battle in Judges 20, 40, and 48, more than 40,000 Israelites are slaughtered in the first 3 days of the Civil War. 40,000 Israelites. That's an exaggeration, but it's meant to cause us to recoil in horror. And we all understand that number a little bit better in a time of plague. Out of more than 26,000 Benjaminite soldiers mustered to fight against Israel, more than 25,000 are killed on the third day, right? Because there are only 600 left at the end. By the end of the book of Judges, the extended family in Israel is literally dead. There is no extended family you can count on. The families of Yavesh Gilad are decimated. 400 virgins are forcibly carried away without leave to bury their dead or mourn their losses. This is a concession that is given to prisoners of war from foreigners. They get 30 days to mourn their losses. These Israelite women given to Benjaminites don't even get that. Fathers and brothers are powerless to protect their daughters and sisters. 200 daughters of Shiloh are captured. Their fathers and brothers are slaughtered. The story of the Levite and the concubine is a metaphor for the complete failure of pre-monarchic Israel, of the social structure to provide refuge for subordinate and dependent members of society, women, children, and even its socially dominant men. The protectors are without protection. Their dependents pay the price, just like the concubine pays the price for the Levite's mortal fear for his own life. By the end of the book of Judges, when you have the Benjaminites cowering in a cave, the social system of patriarchy is in tatters, needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The short answer to the question is an idea that is heretical in ancient Israel. In a culture where God is the only king, the closing chapters of the book of Judges propose human kingship as the solution to this breakdown in the patriarchal tribal system. It's hard for us to imagine that this is a radical idea. We sing children's songs about David Melech Yisrael, King David, King of Israel. We think the Messiah is going to be from the house of the King David. It's very hard for us to imagine a time when the idea of kingship, even if it's a kingship that is appointed by God, anointed by God, is heresy and not mainstream. But from the first book of the Chumash, of the Pentateuch, through the end of the book of Judges, God is the only acceptable king for Israel. Human monarchy is associated negatively with foreign nations and with idolatry. So to go from heresy of a kingship associated with idolatry to orthodoxy, a king appointed from God by God is the only leader, has to be made in a very strong way. How do you make that amazing transformational case? The unthinkable idea that Israel needs a human king is rendered conceivable by the horrific satire of these 3 chapters, Judges 19 through 21, that imagines extreme social conditions in an Israel that lacks a central human leader guided by the word of God. At this point, the idea of hereditary human monarchy is too heretical to be presented directly. Nowhere does the text say, we need a human king whose descendants will, no, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Draw your own conclusions. Exaggeration and metaphor in a satirical setting are used to make the case that Israel needs a human king, as well as a new monarchical social structure to replace the ancient tribal structure that has failed. One tribe can turn against the other. If you have an Israel united under one king, and everybody understands that David tried to dismantle the tribal system that demanded loyalty to the tribe, trying to replace it instead with loyalty to the crown. He didn't succeed 100%, but later kings may have done better. These 3 chapters exaggerate the social chaos in order to make the case for a human king in Israel. The blame for this drastic change is laid upon the Israelites themselves. Nowhere do they take responsibility for the violence, the excess of brutality, the death and destruction. When they have a chance, they blame it on God. Why did God do this to us? Nowhere do they take responsibility in the text. The blame for this drastic change is laid upon the Israelites themselves, who do not deserve to have God as their only king, because Israel is unable or unwilling to follow the word of God. Maybe they need a human intermediary who will insist that they follow the word of God. When each one does what is right in his own eyes, disaster follows. These final chapters of the book answer the theological question, who shall lead the children of Israel and who shall succeed that leader? The biblical books that follow are a test of whether the new monarchic social structure fares any better than the tribal patriarchy that is here revealed to be broken beyond repair. Here is a spoiler alert. Human foibles, human frailty show up in the monarchy just as they did in the charismatic, spontaneous rise of leadership in the book of Judges and in the patriarchal leadership in the books of the 5 books of Chumash. Human beings seem to be incorrigible. Even though the people do what's right in their own eyes without reference to God, nevertheless, the author of the book, this is part of the Deuteronomic history, so we're talking about the Deuteronomic school. Have we talked about that? We've talked about that in this group, right? Deuteronomic school, a group in the 6th and 7th centuries BCE, centered in Jerusalem, made up of the priesthood and the nobility, who wanted to reform what they saw as a flawed social, political, and religious system. They thought animal sacrifices should be replaced by text study and prayer. Guess what, guys? We're all Deuteronomic Jews today. Even though the people persistently do what is right in their own eyes without reference to God, nevertheless, the Deuteronomist is ambivalent about the inauguration of human dynastic monarchy with its attendant human flaws. The critique of monarchy that is a subtext throughout the book of Judges, and I gave you one example of this critique of Saul in just these chapters, but David comes in for critique. All the Judean judges, kings come in for critique, and every single one of the Israelite kings, especially Ahab, comes in for critiques. The critique of monarchy that is a subtext throughout the book of Judges attests to the Deuteronomic ambivalence. The central hereditary monarchy may be necessary in the face of the anarchy that comes along with decentralized charismatic leadership, like you have in the book of Judges. But nevertheless, it's a flawed leadership model. There is even a hint in the very last chapter of the book of 2 Kings, at the end of the very last chapter, that the Deuteronomist is proposing that Israel never, ever have political power, that Israel always be dispersed among the nations to spread the word of God to the other nations. Because when they have power, when they have their own strength and their own might, they're going to be taken over by human frailty and human greed. If you look at the patriarchal blessing that Jacob has, it's the blessing of material wealth. And Esau's blessing is when Jacob forgets God and follows that material wealth, Esau will be powerful and strong and will be able to get the upper hand over his younger brother. So this idea is not just Deuteronomic, it shows up even in the sources that make up the Pentateuch, the Chumash, the 5 books. This idea that Israel is subject to abuses, human greed, human lack of judgment, when Israel has power and wealth, is something that permeates the entire Tanakh, and for some people permeates the history of Israel. So I am saying that the theological message that is conveyed by this horrific episode, these 3 chapters at the end of the book of Judges, is that a change of paradigm is needed because the social structure is broken beyond repair. But even having a king, a change in leadership, a king appointed by God, you're still going to be subject to human frailty. And I want to make the case that this destruction of the social structure is something that also can be read in the horrific events of this week of the gang rape in Eilat. So guys, we have 10 or 15 minutes for comments and questions. That's what I wanted to bring. And just let me summarize for the theme of the course. Rash vows are a mistake. They indicate lack of faith in God. You're going to have to take the consequences of the rash vow as interpreted by God and your poor wording, and don't do it. You can bring vows. Think about the wording, bring a cow, do whatever it is, but don't make open-ended rash vows. When that happens, you don't know what the consequences are. Which brings me to one last point that somebody brought up, which is that God goes along with the poor judgment of the Israelites, starting in chapter 20. The Israelites inquire of God, and God says, go ahead, go do it. It's as though God is imposing the punishment, and their punishment is the consequences of their own judgment. Their own lousy judgment is the punishment that God's allowing to happen. If you have a teenager who keeps making bad choices and you don't let him or her take the consequences of his actions, that person is going to grow up to be an adult who makes bad judgments. God is allowing adolescent Israel to take the consequences of her own horrible judgment. You want to do that? Go ahead. See what happens. And they think, oh, God's on our side. They're not thinking of it as a punishment. There is biblical evidence beyond this. And I refer you, for example, to chapter 22 in 1 Kings, where a lying spirit comes to the prophets who are advising King Ahab and the king of Judah, whether to fight Aram or not. And the lying spirit volunteers for the job and says, go ahead, infuses all the court prophets with lies, saying, go ahead, go fight against them, you'll win. And of course, Ahab is destroyed, and the king of Judah is sorely wounded. So this idea that God will send a misleading or lying spirit, that God will let you take the consequences of your own action. God is not going to rescue you every time. You have to pay attention to the word of God and live accordingly, because you're going to take the consequences. The consequences can be good or they can be bad. That's what it says in the Shema. We read that every morning, right? It's right there. So that's what's going on, I think, in the lack of faith in the rash vow, and in the fact that when Israel finally does the ultimate stupid stuff, God says, go right ahead. Just go right ahead. Okay? So now you can unmute yourselves. We can have a conversation. If you tell me who wants to speak, I will call on you in order. Barry, you go first.
Your comment that human beings are incorrigible, you may be right about that, but it leaves me feeling depressed, and it's okay, and somewhat hopeless. I mean, I've dedicated my life to the idea that at least some level of change is possible in human beings. Though I must say that I've come to the sense that change is limited, and what happens in psychotherapy is that kind of the parts are rearranged in a slightly better way, but character is character. So I feel this tension between a recognition of your statement about incorrigibility is probably true, but I find it very difficult to embrace it entirely, because again, it leaves me feeling too depressed.
Okay, so Barry, I'm going to say two things. Number one, I didn't say incorrigibility. I said human frailty and human foibles are going to arise in all kinds of leaders. And the other thing is, I'm not talking about people who have sought or been treated sought psychotherapy or been treated by a therapist. Okay, so you may in fact have hope that your patients, your clients are provable, make change by a therapist. So we can only make statements about untrammeled human nature. And who is ultimately responsible for human nature? I'm just saying.
God.
Who created us, right?
God.
I'm saying. And the truth is, God learns in the first few chapters of the Bible, God is learning about human nature right alongside us. I mean, God is as surprised as we are by what happens in chapters 1 through 6 of the Bible. So please don't use the word incorrigible. Just, it's human nature. It's not character, it's human nature.
You used it. I wrote it down. It's not my word. You said human beings are incorrigible. And then you gravitated from that to talking about human frailty, but you used the word incorrigible.
Okay, I apologize for the word incorrigible. Please erase it.
Okay, I will.
But didn't God also create us with free will?
Yes, that's part of what makes it interesting for God. You know what the Chinese curse is? May you live in interesting times. So it may be interesting for God, but we're the ones on the battleground. Other comments? Oh, come on. Have I beaten you into submission? Go ahead, Barry.
Okay, so your discussion of satire I found incredibly meaningful. And I realized that in terms of the things I read, I tend to not only gravitate to literature that one could call satirical, but sometimes I talk about, even though I'm not aware of it all the time, that in satirical terms, but I never really understood in the way I did after your discussion that the purpose of satire is to talk about change. That's ultimately what it's about. I found that really useful.
Well, I think that's why you're attracted to it. It's about change.
Probably, yeah.
Saul, you had a comment?
Yeah, I was amazed to learn that this is, I read these chapters and I thought this was really strange stuff. And then you're saying it's satire. Well, now it makes sense.
I don't want
I never thought that.
I want you to be troubled by it. I want you to be agonized by it. Yeah, it does.
Yes, but
it helps.
I think part of the problem is that, at least for myself, maybe others, is that we associate satire with humor. And your drash that you just read for 10 or 15 minutes it totally had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with satire. And it's I guess hard for 20th century or 21st century people to separate humor and satire. Maybe that's the evolution that humans have gone through, that we can't separate satire from humor anymore.
Let me make a suggestion to you, Arthur. Humor and satire both share exaggeration. Exaggeration is part of what makes things funny, and exaggeration is a characteristic of satire. Just because they share a quality doesn't make them identical. So you can use that to make that separation in your mind. I do not believe it is Darwinian. I don't think you can say human evolution makes it impossible to separate satire. And that to me is an exaggeration that's pretty funny. But anyway, I just think that if you think that exaggeration is a tool that is used in both humor and in satire, that may help you make a distinction. Okay, have I spent a lot of time studying this stuff? Yes. Okay, so any other comments, questions? We've got another minute and a half. I did beat you into submission. This should get you all, you should all be yelling at me. Michael, where are you? Okay, Vivian.
Well, I'm just so impressed with your analysis of it because I got nothing out of it except, horror before your discussion. But I just want to mention one other thing. Political cartoons are satire, and they range, from humorous to downright horror. And so it's just a current, source. I still don't see how cutting up a human being is satirical, but maybe in biblical terms it is. I'm just not in that
An
mindset.
exaggeration of Saul's gesture.
Ah,
Okay. It takes it to the extreme of ridiculous, extreme of,
right.
so it's not, you have to see, horror is the point. Revulsion is the point. If you're not horrified and revulsed, you're not reading it properly.
Mm.
And one of the things I want to say in my own defense is that, as I say, I was 43 the first time I read this. For those of you who don't know, I'm going to be 72 on my next birthday, which is very soon. And that is, any way you look at it, close to 30 years, really close to 30 years. And that's how long I have been studying this material in a scholarly, academic, serious way, not even counting, just reading it casually. So I am giving you the benefit of a very long, arduous study process, thinking process. I could not believe that you could have this horror story in the Bible for its own sake without it standing for something else. There had to be a reason for it to be here. And that was my basic premise. And that's what I came up with. So maybe, and that, Susan Nidich came up with a sociological thing, and Stuart Lassine came up with his thing, and I'm building on them. I'm standing on their shoulders. I'm standing on David Marcus's shoulders. He's not happy about that, but I'm doing it anyway. And basically, I'm sharing it with you, and you can disagree with me. You can say, I don't buy it. It's okay, because this is what I came to after my journey through this text.
Yeah, you just don't expect the Tanakh to be satirical. It's not something we've ever encountered. Yeah.
Every single literary genre is here. There's humor. There's scatological humor. There's bathroom humor. We have a king who is murdered on the toilet. I mean, there is all kinds of stuff going on here.
Yeah.
And I want to say one other thing to this group, whoever's left. You guys have been spectacular. It's because of you that I had a chance to study this stuff in more depth, that I had a chance to look at rash vows and their consequences and what it means. It means what it means in terms of faith in God and what God is asking for. And I just have to say, if it weren't for my students, I would be a crazy person, raving, foaming at the mouth in this time of plague. You guys are keeping me sane. So thank you so much. And I can't thank you enough. So I hope we study together again soon. Thank you.
When's your birthday? When's your birthday?
October 6th, but don't anybody remember that. Don't.